Now, President Trump is currently planning to expand charter schools and private school vouchers with the help of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. In fact, that's why Betsy DeVos was put as the head of the Department of Education, so she could push private schools and also deregulate schools as well. So private schools is something that Republicans love, right? Because it allows them to push things like creationism. However, on the other side of the coin, corporate Democrats also love private schools. And not because it allows them to push things like creationism. It's because it helps their donors. And there's a lot of large donors that are funding corporate Democrats. Now, that appeared to have been the case for Hillary Clinton. Now, back during the election, there was an overlooked WikiLeaks published document entitled Policy Book Final. Now, this file was attached to a 2014 email sent to John Podesta, that is Clinton's future campaign chairman. Now, the education portion of the document runs about 66 pages and mostly concerned on or concentrated on K through 12 policy. But it also captures specific input from billionaire donors that are looking to overhaul and, yes, privatize public education. Now, one of the most connected thought leaders discussed in this document is a woman named Laurene Powell Jobs. Now, she's the widow of Apple founder Steve Jobs and the head of the Emerson Collective, that is a prominent education reform advocacy group. Powell Jobs, who has been close with the Clinton family since the late 90s, also sat with Betsy DeVos on the board of Jeb Bush's Foundation for Excellence in Education. So there's the connection here. Hillary Clinton, Jeb Bush, Laurene Powell Jobs, all working towards the same kind of school privatization and the same sort of school reforms. So there are a couple different, sections to this, right? Where first they want to reform, public schools to be more in line with standardized testing. That's, of course, something that both Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton agree with, as well as increasing access to private schools and school vouchers. Now, the problem with school vouchers is that it takes tax money away from public schools who already don't have enough funding. And their funding model is of course, disastrously bad. Now, Powell Jobs, as I said, who was close with the Clintons and was on this Jeb Bush's foundation, also set up billionaire roundtables with Hillary Clinton's advisors through 2015 while donating millions of dollars to Hillary Clinton's super PAC, Priorities USA. So you have these massive Clinton donors that are pushing the idea of privatization as well as more corporate involvement in public education. Notes taken by Clinton aide Ann O'Leary were made in interviews with Powell Jobs and Bruce Reed, CEO of the Broad Foundation and former chief of staff to Joe Biden. According to these notes, the experts were calling for new federal controls, more for-profit companies, and more technology in public schools. Now, I'm okay with having more technology in public schools. I actually agree with that initiative. But the other stuff, well, that's problematic. More for-profit companies. And the federal controls, it would depend on what kind of federal controls were instituted in these schools. Now, according to the notes, one method of introducing more corporate control was targeting the teachers and actually grooming a new generation of teachers. In previous speeches, John Podesta indicated that recruiting and grooming younger, more compliant teachers was one of the plans to overcoming resistance to corporate education reform over the long term. But in the policy book, Bruce Reed also set his sights on teaching colleges, claiming that they, quote, don't deliver the goods. Now, what are they talking about? They're talking about teachers who are more, as I said, compliant with more corporate control over the classroom and more of a corporate curriculum. Powell Jobs suggests letting principals pick their teams, making teachers individually negotiate for salary, expanding online education offerings, and making teaching universities truly selective like TFA in Finland. Now, Finland's an interesting model because they pay their teachers extremely well, especially when you compare it with the United States. It actually has very low teachers, very low pay for educators, because we don't value education in America these days. It's to them more a commodity that should be bought and sold, and not a universal right that should have more funding, that should be, properly funded. Now, in a for-profit model, which is what they're looking at, teachers will be chosen on how little they will cost the company. So that actually drives the pay as well as the quality of teachers downward. There's more. There's evidence that Podesta, O'Leary, and Neera Tanden all raised campaign money from the same billionaire donors who want to privatize education, and with whom that they were also talking policy specifics during the campaign. So they meet with the donors. All these people, part of the Clinton campaign, meet with the donors, and the donors are like, hey man, this is how we want to privatize education. Okay, well, hey, you can talk to us because you've given us money. That's the problem with the access. When you give money, when you're a billionaire donor, you have access to these campaigns, and you have the ability to help shape policy. That is a big reason why we need the money out of politics. Now, on June 20th of 2015, O'Leary sent Podesta an email revealing that the campaign had adopted two of Powell Jobs' suggestions, including infusing best ideas from charter schools into our more traditional public schools. So, again, they pay all this money, they get meetings, they get inside the campaign, and then, oh, would you look at that? Golly gee, they adopted these ideas from these private billionaires. Here we go. And the donors, interestingly enough, had also threatened to cut her off if she did not endorse some of their other ideas, including privatization. John Petrie, a founder of both Democrats for Education Reform and Success Academy, this is New York's largest network of charter schools, told the New York Times, quote, on Hillary Clinton, donors want to hear where she stands. Petrie was explicit, declaring that he and his billionaire associates would instead put money into congressional, state, and local races behind candidates who were favored a more, quote, business-like approach to education and tying teachers' tenure to standardized test scores. Teaching to the test. Again, I'm not in favor of teaching to the test, because that's not a way that you learn. You actually learn by trying to foster a sense of critical thinking, which is what we do not do in high school. We don't do in K through 12 education. They try to do that in colleges. Sometimes it's unsuccessful, but I think and a lot of times it's very successful. And maybe we should actually foster a sense of critical thinking in K through 12 instead of teaching to a standardized test. The reason that they do that, of course, is that there are a lot of private testing centers that end up getting a lot of money and contracts. So that's one of the big problems here. Now, Clinton's advisors had warned her that these wealthy donors like Petrie, Whitney, Tilson, and Eli Broad could walk if she didn't support charter schools. Broad would indeed threaten to withhold funding from Clinton when she criticized charter schools for excluding difficult students. These are students with disabilities. Because what they want is that they want the easiest students. It's a lot like private prisons. Private prisons don't want difficult inmates. They want nice, compliant, non-violent criminals. And they want to get paid exorbitant amounts for housing them. Same thing with these charter schools. They don't want the people with disabilities. They don't want the student with autism that has episodes and sometimes acts out. They don't want to deal with those people. They don't want to deal with people with learning disabilities. No, they want the compliant students that aren't going to cause too much of a fuss, that will end up making them lots and lots of money. That's what they want. In the end, Hillary Clinton, on a lot of these proposals, said, okay, yes sir, yes ma'am, just as long as you keep donating to my campaign, I will give you whatever you want. I'm not here to serve you, not the students, and certainly not the public good. I am here to serve my donors. And so, now there's one more thing here. that influenced her decision. And that is the revolving door. Here you had top Clinton and Obama administration officials that ended up working for nonprofits run by people like Powell Jobs and Tom Steyer. Now, these experts advised Clinton to create and endorse an official education platform that featured a test-centric approach to teaching. Now, the article points out that this sounds a lot like what Jeb Bush and some education reform Republicans were pushing. And that's, of course, as I pointed out before, they had the same donors. A source close to the Walton Family Foundation told Politico, Clinton will have to walk carefully between both sides of the education reform debate so as to not alienate either side. And I said Politico, I actually meant Alternet. She'll be able to receive money from both sides of the education reform debate if she plays her cards carefully. Reading this, John Podesta wrote in a private email, quote, complicated. She won't back off criticism, and that's criticism of charter schools, but won't object to taking contributions. So that is the difference between the public and private position. Publicly, she's against charter schools, or at least is skeptical of charter schools and will speak out against them. But privately, she'll take their money. Wonderful. Now, this, of course, validates a lot of the criticism that a lot of us on the left have of Hillary Clinton, that, hey, man, she'll listen to you as long as you give her money. And that's exactly what happened. Now, there's another problem here. Again, there are people on both sides who agree with privatization as well as other pro-reform policies, like an increase in standardized testing and tying teacher tenure to standardized to that testing. Those people, they didn't go away. They didn't disappear when Hillary Clinton lost. They ended up in the Trump administration. In July, Powell Jobs was reportedly contacted by Ivanka Trump on behalf of the administration, seeking advice on shaping funding approaches for STEM education in public schools. So Powell Jobs is working with the Trump administration on their own sort of education reform. And so every one of these donors is working in their own way to end public education and replace it with corporate-driven policy and education systems. Things like, as I said, private schools, charter schools, vouchers, things like that. So in this case, it looks like that no matter who you voted for in this election between the two major candidates, it's pretty clear that the big donors and the private school companies were always going to get teed up for a big, big win.